Soncoz, makers of the SGA-1 DAC, have also made an amp, the SGA-1. At around $700, how does it compare to other amps such as the Soncoz SGA-1 and Schiit Audio Jotunheim? As well, how does it compare to more expensive gear? Let's find out. Likely the first thing you'll notice about the SGA-1 is, well, the lack of buttons. It only has a volume control. Well, not quite so fast. It actually has a digital menu system for controlling the functions that on other amps are controlled via switches. So if you want to switch things such as the inputs and gain, rather than flick a switch, you actually have to go into a menu system, which later on we'll see can be a good thing or maybe a bad thing. But like other amps, it has inputs and outputs. So let's take a look at those. Now, if you're familiar with stereo components, the inputs and outputs of the SGA-1 will be fairly familiar. However, if you're not so familiar, let me give you a quick overview. This amplifier is a balanced amplifier, so ideally you'd use the balanced input and output, which are both XLR, but you also have single-ended inputs and single-ended preamplifier outputs if you want to use them with some device that takes those. Now for input, it's not too critical whether you use the single-ended or balanced inputs, as single-ended input will be converted to balanced inside the amp and you'll get the full benefits of the amplifier itself. If you do have something, say you're using this with active speakers or a power amp, you'll probably get the most benefit using the XLR outputs if at all available, so that you use the full circuitry inside the amp for the preamplifier function. Likewise for the headphone outputs. The SGA-1 has two balanced outputs, respectively a 4-pin XLR socket, which is very common going back many years, and the new standard both for portable and full-size use, the 4.4mm Pentacon connector. It also has a 6.3mm or 1/4-inch jack, which you can adapt to 3.5mm if necessary for use with, well, full-sized headphones or in-ear monitors. Although, of course, with in-ear monitors, you can also use them, say, with a Pentacon jack. But primarily, to get the most out of the amp, as it does use a balanced circuit design, you'll want to use one of the balanced sockets for use with headphones or in-ear monitors. The functionality aspect of the SGA-1, however, is a little bit odd. So let's take a closer look at that. The main knob on the SGA-1, well, it acts not only as the volume control, where you can turn it up and down, but it also allows you to switch all the inputs, gain, and whether the headphone output is balanced or single-ended. So to do that, unlike flicking a switch on a regular amp, normally it adjusts the volume as such. If you want to adjust the gain, you press it in, switch it to gain mode, press again, and then you can adjust the gain up from between 0 dBs up to 6 decibels. And why this just simply isn't a switch, I'm not quite sure. If you want to adjust the input, change the input to balance to single-ended, you go in, 1, 2 clicks, and then press again, and then you can switch to single-ended. Likewise, if you want to switch from the headphone output from balanced to single-ended, you have to press in, and then it's 1, 2, 3, press again, and switch. So of course this becomes a little bit tedious if you're switching inputs often. So if I want to switch this back now and I'm not being fast enough turning the knob, I'm going to have to go here. Oh, no, I missed it. So you can see how this becomes a little bit fiddly and irritating sometimes if you want to switch inputs and outputs regularly. Now I want to switch the headphone output to balanced. I've got to do this all over again. Kind of very unnecessarily tedious, something that is just generally done via a switch on other amps. And that's where I'm going to say here, if you're a person who's going to be switching the inputs and outputs a lot, you're going to find this amp very annoying. But if you're someone who has just a balanced pair of headphones and is just going to use, say, an SGA-1 or one device as the source, it's not going to be so much of a problem. One of the nice advantages of this setup is that if you do switch, inputs or outputs, it will ramp the volume up slowly after the switch so that you don't suddenly blast your ears out. Say if you've gone from a quiet single-ended source to a louder or a higher output balanced input, you're not going to suddenly get a blast of volume which is going to cause hearing damage. The other nice thing about this kind of setup, at least the volume control, is that it will ramp up and down slowly if you turn the knob slowly, but if you want to ramp it down fast, a quick flick of the knob and, well, you've avoided an ear blast if you've suddenly had the volume too high. The SGA-1 doesn't have a large power output. Its maximum output from the balanced headphone socket is 420 milliwatts, which compared to some of the kind of 1 watt or 2 watt or above power output of some of the other amps it competes with, does seem quite low. However, for something like use with planar headphones such as these HiFiGo Arias, it was quite sufficient, given if you don't listen super loud, and listening super loud will damage your hearing anyway. I listen at, say, a moderate level of about 70 to 80 decibels on average, so the power output was quite sufficient to drive headphones such as these Arias, and in that case it did a very good job. Now, it's kind of overall tonalities. We say, people say amps shouldn't have a tonality, they should measure perfectly flat, blah, 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 blah. But that's simply not true and just doesn't match reality. Now, I'm going to assume that the chord gear I have here, this TT2&M scaler, are perfectly dead flat, neutral, uncolored. Well, at least I know their maker aimed them truly to be that way. So in comparison, something like this SGA-1, as well as other amps such as the SA-1 and Jotunheim, are on the warm side of things. And I mean a very slight touch sense of warmth versus something like the chord gear. This is not necessarily a bad thing, and maybe not something you're likely to notice with headphones if you don't compare it with other gear. I would generally call it on the neutral side of things, as far as it's not, they say, deliberately colored like some tube amps and other equipment. It is designed to be kind of neutral and uncolored, generally as you'd expect from equipment of this type. The interesting thing was I did compare it, at a moderate listening level to this Singsa SA-1. I modified this one with what's called the input capacitor bypass mod. Now, in the Singsa SA-1, if you saw my review, they have some capacitors on the input, obviously to protect the amplifier circuit from, well, I presume badly made equipment that outputs, well, more than a signal, maybe just full DC. So in that, the problem with putting capacitors anywhere in the signal path is that they can color the sound, and it did make the sound slightly less clear. Bypassing them, which was done at least in this one, and I don't know about the latest ones if they've changed it, was done so by adding a little jumpers onto sets of pins to bypass the capacitors. And I've done this mod, and it did clean up the sound nicely. So I compared this modified SA-1 to the SGA-1 level matched, including level matching with the Jotunheim. And I did this by taking my headphones, putting my phone between them, running the sound meter program, and then playing a 1 kilohertz tone through this entire system, and then lining up the volume controls to within 1/10 of a decibel. So that is, I consider, accurate enough. Now, listening with, well, it wasn't necessarily the Arias, but one of the planar headphones around I have around here, such as the Final D8000 Pro or Meze Elite, or I even have the LCD5s in here as well. Listening with those, I couldn't actually detect any audible difference between the SGA-1 and the modified Singsa SA-1. So considering that you don't have to modify an SGA-1 to get that slightly better sound that you do for the SA-1, maybe the SGA-1 has that slight advantage in that respect. Now, if you've seen my SA-1 review, you can probably predict what I'm going to say next about the Jotunheim. The Jotunheim was a touch warmer in sound than both these amps. It had a slightly better sense of depth to the sound, but it seemed to be, slightly narrower, slightly warmer. So it was a very slight difference in tuning. Now, one of the advantages the Jotunheim has is considerably more power. Now, while all amps were fine driving something like the Arias, which are an example of a typical pair of planar magnetic headphones, with something that requires a serious amount of power, HiFiMan's Susvaras, well, the story was different altogether. The Susvaras require a lot of power. These and the HE6 SE are kind of, well, they're not really common headphones. They require an amount of power that's more akin to something that speakers require. Now, given that the SGA-1 doesn't have that much power output, the result when I tried listening with them was predictable. The sound was kind of flat, the bass was kind of weak. It wasn't a good result at all, and we're getting close to maximum volume, and it just couldn't do justice to these headphones. So while it's a rare combination, people do ask about it, so I thought I'd mention it as well. However, whether I was driving, say I have a pair of HD8XX in for review, or any of the HD800 series, drove these and other high impedance headphones quite fine. So overall, if you're not a super loud listener, and again, if you do listen super loud, I would highly recommend stopping that habit because you will destroy your hearing, and listening at moderate levels, which is probably the most ideal to get the best quality results out of your listening experience. It drove headphones quite fine, and the 420 milliwatts power output was more than sufficient. However, it did have one advantage over something like the Jotunheim. The Jotunheim was outputting noise to IEMs from the single-ended output, which in the single-ended output is something I might consider using when I want to use, say, in-ear monitors, which require vastly less power. However, Jotunheim output noise on the single-ended output, and actually to use in-ear monitors, I had to use the balanced output. So no such problems with the SGA-1, which was great whether I used whichever output for IEM use. So you're thinking, do these amps at $700 odd, how do they compare with something vastly more expensive? So as you may have seen before, I have a Headamp GSX Mini in here. Headamp GSX Mini is a really nice amp. It's kind of more like in design, a cut down speaker amp. So it has a considerably more comprehensive amplification circuit in there than you might get in a regular headphone amp. And likewise, using the same kind of source, whether it be something like Shit Audio's Yggdrasil or this Chord TT2 DAC, the GSX Mini provided kind of more depth to the sound and more dynamics, more punch when on notes compared to the SGA-1 and these kind of $400 to $700 amps. Now, it wasn't a dramatic difference, it wasn't kind of the same as the price difference is between them. Once you start to get into gear at this kind of range, that's when you start getting into the law of diminishing returns, whereas if you want to get a jump in performance, you need to spend a lot more money for less of a jump. Lastly, I tried plugging the SGA-1 into a variety of sources. So first of all, the SGD-1 was a nice match with this amp. Although not having even listened with it for a while, I immediately noticed that slight kind of edginess that you get with ESS DACs of this kind. I also tried it with something else in for review, an Audio GD R2R11, the new version for this year. This is a non-oversampling R2R DAC, and in vast contrast to the SGD-1 and similar DACs, it is something that sounds nice and doesn't measure so well. But it was interesting to hear the kind of softer, rounder sound of the R2R11 coming through the SGA-1. So it was enough performance coming through from the SGA-1 that, the kind of DAC that you use will be noticeable. Ultimately, if you're the kind of person who is going to use one DAC and one pair of headphones and you're not going to switch around the inputs and outputs much, then I would actually recommend the SGA-1 as a really good amp if your budget is around the $700 mark. However, if you're someone who's going to be switching inputs and outputs fairly regularly, you may find this one button system to be highly annoying. So depending on whether that functionality is going to be okay for you or an annoyance, do consider whether the SGA-1 might be a good or bad amp for you. So as always, thanks to HiFiGo for sending one of these over for review. Also thanks to my patrons for supporting me. If you are wondering what kind of gear is good for you, consider becoming one of my patrons and I'll happily help you out find the right gear for you. As always, thanks for watching and I'll see you online.